This podcast is about reticular lesions. Reticular lesions are very common. This, for example, is a junctional flux nevus, and dermatoscopically we can see a very nice reticular pattern that is characteristic for this type of nevus. But not every lesion with a reticular pattern is a melanocytic lesion. Before we explore the differential diagnosis of lesions with a reticular pattern, we have to talk about the anatomic basis of the reticular pattern, because only then we can understand what are the possible diagnoses. And here are 6 possibilities. Look at A first. Here we see a reticular pattern dermatoscopically, but we don't see an increase in the number of melanocytes. We only see hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes. This is, for example, what we see in a solar tiger with a reticular pattern. In B, C, and D we see nests of pigmented melanocytes at the base of the rete ridges. This is what we see in a junctional nevus, for example a Klux nevus. E, here we see hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes, but only at the base. This is what we see in inkspot lentigo, which also has a reticular pattern. And F, here we see thick reticular lines. The reticular lines are thicker than the holes in between. Why? Because there is broadening of the rete ridges, and the broadened rete ridges are filled with neoplastic melanocytes, like in this melanoma in situ. Now let's look at some examples. Here is a reticular lesion dermatoscopically that is not a melanocytic lesion. It is, surprise, a SEP-K. We have a reticular pattern at the periphery. Why? Because there is hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes. This is, at least at the periphery, a reticulated SEP-K. Here is the histopathologic slide, and we can see hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes, no increase in the number of melanocytes. Here's a milia-like cyst. We didn't see that on dermatoscopy. This is another example of a lesion with a reticular pattern. We see only a reticular pattern, and the reticular lines are thin. Now let's look at this part. Here's a close-up. We see thin reticular lines, but we also see some brown and black dots on the reticular lines. Now, this is a junctional flux nevus, and what does this mean? Why do we see a reticular pattern in a junctional flux nevus? Because there is also hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes, but an increase in the number of melanocytes with nests at the base of the rete ridges. Here is the proof. This is the same lesion that we saw dermatoscopically. Here is the close-up, and you can see hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes, but also nests of melanocytes at the base of the rete ridges. The reticular lines are thin because the rete ridges are thin. And why do we see black and brown dots on the reticular lines? Because there are clumps of melanin in the stratum corneum over the rete ridges. This is usually a sign of benignancy. Here is a close-up. Clinically, and now dermatoscopically, we see a reticular pattern again, but now the lines are not brown, they are black or very dark brown, and this is the typical example of an inkspot lentigo. Why do we see a reticular pattern in an inkspot lentigo? Because there is hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes, but only at the base of the rete ridge. So here is the same lesion that we saw dermatoscopically. Here is a close-up, and we can see hyperpigmentation of basal keratinocytes only at the base of the rete ridge. And why is it so black? Because the melanin is so dense. Here is a close-up. This is a lesion that could be a nevus or a melanoma. Dermatoscopically, we see it has a reticular pattern, but now the reticular lines are thick and not thin. What does thick mean? The lines are, at least in some parts, thicker as the holes in between. Of course, there's also color variegation, but there's also a pattern of thick network lines. Why do we see thick network lines here? Because it's a melanoma in situ and the radial regions are broadened and filled with neoplastic melanocytes. Here's the proof. This is the same lesion histopathologically, and we can see thick radial ridges and they are filled with pigmented neoplastic melanocytes. And this is why we see thick reticular lines. So what is the differential diagnosis of a lesion with a reticular pattern? First, we may have a solar lentigo or a flat seborrheic keratosis, a reticulated seborrheic keratosis. In a solar lentigo, the radial ridges are thin and it's usually not heavily pigmented, so the reticular lines are light brown. Second, we may have a melanocytic nevus with a junctional component, but if we see only a reticular pattern, it's usually a junctional crux nevus. Usually the radial ridges are thin and also the reticular lines are thin and the color is light brown. We could have a melanoma. Melanoma in situ may have only a reticular pattern, but sometimes, not always, sometimes the reticular lines are thick and we can use the thick reticular lines as a clue to differentiate melanoma in situ from a junctional crux nevus. And fourth, ink spot lentigo may have only a reticular pattern, usually has only a reticular pattern, but the reticular lines are dark brown or black and we have the typical and characteristic appearance of an ink spot lentigo.